organization. My name is Joe Tennis. Oh, I'll wait for the table. We're oversold, it seems. Yay. Awesome. My name is Joe Tennis. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington's Information School, and I will be serving as your conferencier for the next 2 days. Essentially the MC, I think. So I'm trying to keep things moving, do introductions. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. First of all, I wanted to thank Johannes Britz and the the UWM Office of Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for last night's reception. It was a lovely reception for those who could make it. Apologies for those who missed it. But we will have plenty of food and celebrating over the next 2 days. Logistics. Washrooms just through the corridor, marked, I think, quite clearly, but on the right-hand side. We'll do introductions before, so I'll introduce all 3 presenters before, so that we can move seamlessly through the presentations. At the end of the presentations, we'll have a discussion session. For the keynotes, the keynote speaker will moderate the discussion session. For the group of presentations, I'll be doing the moderating for the questions and answers. Of course, if you have any concerns about that, please do let me know. Jonathan Cope? Yes. Can I get your bio information? before you speak. Thank you very much. So I will be shouting 5 minutes for the speakers from the corner of the room, and then we'll move on as far as that's concerned. Almost everybody has about 20 minutes, so keep that in mind. Right, I'm going to moderate those. So we will have lunch here from 12 to 1. So we'll have the early morning session, we'll do lunch from 12 to 1, and then we'll continue into the afternoon. And yeah, so I'll make an announcement more about the afternoon stuff later. All right, so without further ado, I'm here to introduce Dr. Jens-Erik Meij, who's an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. His research looks at basic questions about the nature of information phenomena. He's explored these from a variety of conceptual points, for example, semiotics, cognitive work analysis, late modernity, philosophy of language, and trust, often with a focus on issues and questions in the organization of information. He's contributed conceptual construction as well as methodological and programmatic papers that have helped forward thinking about the organization of information. His most recent publications explore authority and trust in information systems and services and contemporary classification theories, conceptual foundation in modernity. Jens-Erik currently serves on the board of directors of the American Society for Information Science and Technology, as consulting editor of the Knowledge Organization Journal, as member of the editorial board for ASLID proceedings, and was the conference chair for the iConference 2012. So without further ado, Jens-Erik Meij is here to talk to us about just classifications.
And thanks for organizing this conference to the Information Research Group here at the School of Information Studies. I think this is a very important event. I enjoyed coming to the first conference a few years ago, and I look forward to, I think even before the first conference I asked Hope, so when are you going to have the next one? And I kept rocking that. And I think last night I said, so when are we having the next one? I think this is very important, and I think it's very important that we do investigate and talk about these issues in information organization. I think they've been somewhat overseen and not taken serious. So I think it's important to see this many people here who are engaged in these types of issues. So I want to talk a little bit about my title. A couple of people have already asked, so what do you mean you read, just or just? I actually mean both things. And it was quite deliberate that I chose this title to have it, to sort of have that question in your head of what do we mean when we say classifications, and what do we think of? And many people, I think today say, oh, it's just classifications. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. Today we Google and all that. Who cares? And I actually think we should care, and I think we are having a responsibility, and it's important for us to talk about why classifications are important. And I often say in my classes, think about the person in a small village that comes into a a small city comes into a library and starts looking for information about their own sexuality or their own race or their own ethnicity, and they bump into beauty. And what are they being told by that story about themselves when they're starting to explore themselves? I think serial classifications are very important, and we need to take them seriously. And I also think basically that classification is inherited in language. I'm going to talk about that a little later. So the words that we use, the concepts that we use, I think of that as classification as well. Those words are very important. Words do harm and do damage, and I think it's important to take that serious, down to the level of what we call it. So if we want to talk about just classification, the second meaning of the word, how do we develop classifications and think about classifications that do not do harm or that are fair? And that's the basic question. But I think to get to the second, we need to take the first very serious. So we need to go beyond to think about us just classifications of what, but just put it on the shelf and we'll find it. And need to get beyond that, and we need to take that act very serious in itself to be able to talk about how we can develop just classifications. So the basic message here is, before we launch into the discussion, is that classifications are a serious matter, and they do harm if they're not done properly. And I think there's going to be plenty of examples throughout the next couple of days of where classifications or information organizations do harm and do damage. I'm not going to spend too much time on these examples, and I think we'll talk lots about that in the next couple of days. Starting out, and I think as a basic assumption for talking about classifications, I think we need to think of them as social institutions, that they are the foundation of, that they do the foundation of what any library or any information service do, that they are classifications, they are social institutions, and that, as I say here, justice is the first virtue of any social institutions, and that we need to think about classifications in libraries and beyond as social institutions. So when we have talked about classification, we've often looked at classification in the past few years, mainly pushed by Theo Jordan and others, of looking at the epistemology of classification. And that we've looked at that, and I think we've come very far in thinking about the epistemology of classification and understood that much better. And I think what's needed now is to think about ethics and epistemology of classification. And I think one of the main messages of my talk here today is to say we need to think about those things together. We have often talked about epistemology, and then sort of we have added ethics as something that we add on to classification afterwards. I think it's important that we think of epistemology and ethics together. That ethics is not something we add on afterwards. It's not that that's going to be nice. It would be nice if we could develop a just classification. That's the foundation, that's the beginning, and it begins by starting to think about our epistemological stance. We can't separate the two things together. So today, what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about review of classification theory, to tell you a little bit about where are we and how did we come to where we are today. And as in asking the question, how did we get here, is to also argue a particular position. Try to convince you that we have come to a particular point in classification theory and thinking about classification. And it's from that position that we need to incorporate and think about the ethical dimension. So what are those challenges? What are the issues that we're facing today? What are the basic questions that we need to ask? And how do we then get to thinking and talking about just classification as a natural component of what we do in this field? Before we get to talk about where we are today, we need to think a little bit about some basic foundations, some basic assumptions in the field of cataloging classification, library organization, bibliographic classification, information organization, knowledge organization, whatever you want to call it. And I think we can pick up any textbook, and the textbook will start out saying something like two quotes that I have here. Value judgments have no place in the creation of bibliographic finds. And we've always assumed that a library or bibliographic classification has no politics, has no religion, and has no morals. That is a point of being neutral and objective and describe things as they are, and not interfere, not have any values, and not think about those things. That we've often assumed that that's not what we want. We want our catalogs. There's some basic things that we want our catalogs to be. We want them to be neutral. We want them to be objective. We want them to be unbiased, and we want them to be true. So basic foundation, and I think we've all heard that, and I think many of us have said it. It's a lie. You can't do that. It's impossible. There's no such position. What have we tried to aim for in most bibliographic classification theory, most classification development? We have aimed for the one best system that would sort of help us develop a classification in hopefully worldwide. If we could just have one basic classification that we can spread around so we can interchange bibliographic records, so we have interoperability, so we don't have to do this. So get away from the local position. The dream of Dewey in that church 130 years ago, we're still aiming for that. You know, when he sat back and Eureka, we shouldn't do things differently, we should do things the same according to the universe of knowledge. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist. Let's get over it. So what have we tried to say? Well, we've tried to say that a common dictum, or the way that we think about classification, is that it shouldn't be critical. And I think Montfield in 46 talked about this. Very important book. But he said, whenever we do, whatever precautions that we take for being non-critical, it will be critical because classification is an express judgment. We do say things. We do say, well, it's this hierarchical construction. We think about it this way. We put this thing over here. No, it should go over here. It should go over here. That's judgment. That's a value judgment, and we do something about it. Now, it's this sort of way of thinking about the epistemology of knowledge is based on one basic assumption. It's based on a basic assumption that actually been with us for a very long time, and then I think many people still believe. And I think if we ask anybody on the street, this is what they would say as well. And I think when I talk to my 11-year-old son, that's the way it is. He would say, the world is what it is. You know, just go and take a look at it. Now, he also wants to be a chemist. Discussions about science and that. Some level, you can imagine that in our household. Just go and figure out what it is. Look at science. We see that argument over and over again. Don't worry too much about it, because science will figure it out. Science will explain things. Science will help us understand what the world really is and the way that it is. We'll uncover it. We even say the same things in some of the texts that when we talk about index. We say, uncover the concepts hidden in the document. It's like it's in there, we just have to uncover it. And there's this language thing that's in the way, and these moral values that we bring, and these view of the world that we bring with us that is in the way. But I don't think that's in the way. That's the basic fact of life. That's the basic fact of being a human. That's the way you look at it. So that's one thing that I think has been with us for a very long time. This assumption that the world is what it is. The documents are what they are. Look at the item at hand and figure out what the subject matter is. Can't do that. And I think we've gone away from that. Another thing that I think has been with us for a very long time is this idea that classification is about similarity, about likeness, about putting things that are alike together, and that we should always just build classification based on the characteristics of the individual items and put those things that are alike together. I think that's a wonderful thing, but we have to think critically about what that means and what the implications are. Our friend Rodners talked a little bit about it when he said likeness contributes little to understanding classification. It actually doesn't help us anything to say they have to be alike. Because what does likeness mean? What is it? What does it mean that two things are alike? Likeness, the likeness is not a quality of things. It's the relationship between the things. And establishing that relationship. So we can ask, what is the basic problem of thinking about it? likeness or similarity as the basic foundation. And give you an example. So if we take two things, like a lawnmower and a plum, like these two things, and we think about how they are alike. And they're actually alike in many different ways. As quoted here, they're alike in the sense that they both weigh less than 10,000 kilos. They both did not exist 10 million years ago. They both can be dropped. They both cannot hear. And they both take up space. So they are alike in many, many different ways. So the basic question is not to say that things that are alike should go together on the shelves or wherever we're classifying, but it's to figure out what is it that makes things to alike or similar. What is it that why do we choose those certain aspects over some other aspects? And to think about similarity or likeness in itself is too flexible. We need to think about how do we establish the likeness, how do we establish what things are and how things are used, and go from there and think about how do we classify things, and how are classifications established. So I think one important way to think about classification, and one important aspect of classification, is sort of about just the basic foundation of human life. And I think this little drawing here tells, it says all about how we actually look at the world. So, so we think about classification of looking at the world from this way. If I was a 5-year-old kid and I was down here on 9th Avenue and I lived in this little apartment over here, this is my world and this is what it looked like, right? Everything that's close to me is really big, right? And then I look down at the street and there's some people there. I can see people on the streets and there are houses, and down there there's 10th Avenue, and down there's Hudson River and then Jersey, and up there's Canada. That's about the size of Canada. Over there's China. Mexico's down there. There's some big rocks out there. Kansas is Las Vegas is out there somewhere. But that's the way that we classify as well. That's the way that most of us interact with the world. Things that are very close to us, things that are important to us, is really big, really important, and we see the details of all of that. Things that are less important or that we don't understand that well, the further away. We don't describe them as they really are. We pick out some things and we say, oh, it's Canada. Japan is over there as well. China is over there. But they're about the same size. Right? So this is not important. So the way we interact with the world is things that are important to us, are close to us, are more important, and we describe that in more details. And that's the same thing when we interact with bibliographic classification schemes, or we interact with records that we want to describe and represent in bibliographic classification schemes. We're very good at seeing the details of some stuff, and there's some stuff that are not important. But if we take that as the assumption that this is the way that we look at the world, and not, we can look at the world from an objective point of nowhere and describe things as they really are. We cannot. Then we come up with two different epistemologies, or two different ways of approaching and looking at the world. One that assumes that your personal position and where you are born and what you look at, and, the language that you speak and the culture that you grew up with is important. And another one that assumes that we can put all that aside and look at the world as it really is. And I think it's an important choice. I take this position. It's perfectly fine with me if you take this position, but please explain to me how you do it. How can we separate out what our personal positions is from a description of the world? We'll get to that later. It's a very important epistemological or ontological decision to be made. We haven't seen any good defenses of this position here yet, especially not in our literature. In other literatures they're there, but we haven't seen that in our literature. Okay. So another way to think about this is this wonderful quote that to me explains how important culture is and how important it is to understand things that are well beyond just understanding the language. We all know if I said to you, I want a lettuce burger, we all have some idea about what that is. But you will all laugh and say it doesn't make any sense. But why does a cheeseburger make sense? Well, there's you know, we have agreed that we call this thing a cheeseburger, even though there's also lots of other things in it. But all of a sudden, the cheese is important, but all the other things are. We don't call that out. We just say it's a burger. It goes with eating a hamburger, eating a cheeseburger. The ham is, I don't know what a ham is, but we cannot say a lettuce burger. It doesn't make any sense. So there's something in our culture. There's something in the way that we think about food and that we think about these items that we have all agreed on. We have all at some point agreed on that is a cheeseburger. I would, okay, remember that, Jill, when Pearl grows up? Yeah, so there's, you know, at some point, Pearl will get enculturated into thinking about burgers from a particular point of view, a North American point of view. If she lived somewhere else in the world, she would probably look at these things a little bit different. So what is important here is to think about what that does to the way that we look at the world. And the way what it does is that we cut up the world. We look at the world from a particular point of view. We say that is a cheeseburger, that is a hamburger, that is a burger with lettuce in it. You can have that, but there's usually lettuce, unless you are specific, you not have lettuce. You will have lettuce in it. And all these things, it is just there. It's part of living together and agreeing on that this is the way that we do. Now, there actually wasn't that point where you had to agree that you just get forced into it. But what's important is that it affects the way that we think about the world. It affects the way that we organize our everyday life. It affects the way that we think about who we are and think about the way that we position ourselves. It affects us when we go into the hamburger stores and also a hamburger, that we cannot say lettuce burger. We can say, you know, I want a hamburger, this is the lettuce burger. What's important about that is that if we switch that and think about information professionals, think about the classification schemes that information professionals maintain and create, is, I think, a very important switch from thinking about how do we as individuals interact in the world. And I think that one of the more confusing things about lots of literature and epistemology and ethics is that it talks about individuals. What is the best thing that I can do? How do I think about the world? How do I get to know the world? What are good deeds that I can do? But information professionals have a completely different responsibility. What they do is they organize and represent and call on things and name things for other people, which affects the way that they look at the world. So from thinking about how do I live on the 5th Avenue or 9th Avenue in New York and look at the world, to saying, okay, now my responsibility is to describe for somebody else, you know, what it means. That is a very important distinction. And that's why this position over here, as being neutral and objective, is really attractive. Because then we can say, well, it doesn't matter what your personal values are, because you should leave that aside and just describe things as they really are. But to be able to do that, we need an ontology and epistemology that goes with that position, and we don't have that. And one of the reasons is that context really do matter. It really does matter who you are, where you are, and when your statements are made. So time and space matters. Let me give you an example. An example of kitchen chairs. So I found some pictures of kitchen chairs. Black and white. You sometimes say that. Anyway. And I know these are kitchen chairs. And why do I know they're kitchen chairs? Because I found them on Google. Typed in kitchen chairs, image, this is what they came up. You know? So now I know these are kitchen chairs. There's some of them that don't look like kitchen chairs to me. But anyway, we can also ask from a cultural perspective, when is a chair a kitchen chair versus just a chair? Is it when I move it into a particular room in my house that it becomes a kitchen chair? Or is it born as a kitchen chair? Is there some chairs that are definitely kitchen chairs and some that are not kitchen chairs? What if I live in a house where I don't have a kitchen? Can I have a kitchen chair? These are sort of fundamental questions of life, I think, and very important to explore. But again, we only have the concept of a kitchen chair because we live in a culture where we have kitchens, and we have chairs in the kitchen, and we like to eat in our kitchen. We have an eat-in kitchen. I mean, these are cultural concepts that we cannot translate into other cultures. But to understand the concept of a kitchen chair, to understand the concept of anything, we have to understand the role that object plays in the world. So to understand what a chair is and when it is a kitchen chair, we have to understand the role that it plays, so we have to understand what a And why would you put a chair in the kitchen? It would be in the way because I'm cooking there. No, some people actually like to sit and eat in their kitchens. Oh, those type of people, people with big houses have big kitchens, but not in my house, which is really small. It's really complicated. But anyway, if we look at the notion of a kitchen chair, and we think about the concept, the context in which we could place a kitchen chair, there's probably a million different contexts where we could do it. We could think about a kitchen chair as something you can sit on, along with milk stool, big rubber ball, plastic plate. We could think about kitchen chairs as a furniture in our house, and we could list all the furniture, a coffee table, dresser, television, tea, and a bed. Those are all examples of furniture. We could think about a kitchen chair as something that has 4 legs, right, along with a piano and an easel and a towel and stuff like that. Or we can think about a kitchen chair as the stuff that was in my office space. So I had a kitchen chair in my office space. I knew it was a kitchen chair, but it was because it used to be in the kitchen, so we moved it into an office space. But that was a kitchen. Now it's a kitchen chair in the office space. And it's there along with other things that are in my room. So now it's a kitchen chair, but it's an example of a kitchen chair that is classified with other things that are in the room. Or, I've been working on a long time, just one presentation, so I need to stretch my back and use a kitchen chair to stretch my back. So it depends on what concept we put the kitchen chair in. We bring out certain features from the kitchen chair. We point out certain things that are important to the kitchen chair to make it like the other things. There's none of these examples where you say, oh, the kitchen chair is definitely not like the other ones. It's like the other ones in particular relationships, because I picked them out for you and I said, here's the relationship for all these 5 different things. So what's important is that when we try to figure out what a thing is, or what a book is, journal, an image, a piece of music, theater, whatever, it's not a search for an essential characteristic of that thing. There's no such thing. There's no such essential characteristics of a thing. It's a fiction. We made it up. We made it up because we had a particular view of the world. We had a particular ontology that went with the idea of an essential identity. I have to later put that aside and forget about it and build the notion of classification and something else. One way to think about it is through an association. And think about classification as association. We associate different things with each other, so we can make 5 different groups of that, in which we put a kitchen chair in each of them, and by association. But if there's association, there's also people. And there's people in a particular context, and people in a particular culture, speaking a particular language. So there's all those things that are all of a sudden much more important than the things themselves. And if we want to figure out how to classify particular things, kitchen chairs, whatever, hamburgers, we have to look at the whole background behind it, the literature, the culture, the context. Here's another example. Does anybody have one of these at home? Because we can make a little bit of fun of it. It looks like this, it looks very cute. But anyway, one of those things, what's important about that is to again sort of stress this notion that we choose particular things. And why do we choose particular features of that little cute animal that we use to classify it with other animals, so that when we have a sharp dividing line between the little cute thing and the big, and I like to say that, it's a Great Dane, the Great Dane and the little cute thing, but this little cute thing over there actually looks, in my mind, very much like that other little cute thing over there. But no, very different. Nothing to do with each other. Why is it that we choose, why do we choose certain characteristics? Why do we classify the little cute thing, which seems so much more like the lamb, but then we used to classify it with a big fucking dog, Great Dane? Why? What is it that makes it? And someone say, well, it's a dog, and it's a lamb, and the biological classification, but then you're back in arguing for a particular type of view of the world that's based in a particular view of the world. And I bet you, if you have a 5-year-old girl who walks into the library and says, I want to look at books with cute animals, she doesn't really care much about whether it's one of those little terriers or one of those lambs. She will not look at the big great thing. So again, context matters, how we ask the question matters. So why is it important to spend time on that? It's important to spend time on it because for a very long time we understood classification and categorization completely different. We understood it to be boxes of things, and things were in the box or they were outside the box. And there were certain things that they had in common. So we understood classification essentially like this, right? It's a box, flat top, sharp sides. Either things are inside it, right? Either it's A or it's not A. Either it's a hamburger, it's not a hamburger. Either it's a. Then we have these veggie things. Is that a hamburger? Anyway, either it's a cute animal, or it's not a cute animal. Either it's this or that. But we thought about the world and we thought about classification this way for a very long time. That, I think, is what we're up against. And I think we've walked into talk to most people on campus even and asked them about classification. This is what they would explain to us. I've slightly explained it. Yes or no, either it is. It can't be, there's a well-defined boundary that makes it in or out. And everything that's inside it are alike, things like that. So I think we've come to a point now where we say, it depends. Is it day or is it night? There's places in between. So I think most people now maybe think about classification this way. There's some dead-like examples and there's some overlaps and there's some points where we could say, well, let's go day and night, let's go to good book, a bad book, let's go to crime, and romance, and all these things. There's tons of examples. And I think that has helped us sort of get to a certain point. But perhaps that's not the best way to classify, think about classification either. So the way that I think about classification of categories today, it's more like this, like sort of parts put together, right? They consist of a little bit of that and a little bit of argument over here, but they're just about to fall apart. And so think about I think about classification this way, as sort of patches of particular, sort of, quite, almost, more or less, right? That type of classification. So I say, it's sort of a dog, but then, it's tiny and it's very vulnerable and it's cute. And there's this other thing that more like a dog, but then it's actually more like a wolf. But, I think that's the way that we talk about the world, and I think that's the way we interact with the world. And I think that's a much better explanation of how we think about categories and how we think about classification. So I think this has brought us to how we think about classification theory today. And the way that we think about classification theory today is essentially based on three different basic assumptions about classification. The first assumption is that there's already a classification theory. So when you walk into a culture, they already decided what a hamburger is. They already decided that you cannot say lettuce burger. You can try to convince them that lettuce burgers make sense, but it's going to take a while. Right? There's already a classification there that is part of it already. When you want to describe things as they really are, you do that from within a particular point of view, from within an understanding, or from within a culture. And classification is the condition of language and knowing. So we cannot separate classification from language and knowing. How we think about classification is part of our language. It's part of how we speak, it's part of what we know, it's already there. And I think that has led us to some endpoints for bibliographic classification theory, which I think is important as well. One is that we've sort of come to accept now that any classification scheme is an expression from a particular point of view. That all classification view the world from a particular avenue, whether it's 9th Avenue or somewhere else. They look at the world from a particular view of the world and describe that world. They look at, and classification in themselves cannot be good or bad, but they're good or bad for particular purposes. So there needs to be a purpose behind that classification. I think we've come to accept that as well. And this notion that certain classification for those purposes would then emphasize some things over other things. So I think these are sort of basic assumptions that we've come to accept in bibliographic classification theory. What we're still puzzling, I think, in epistemology as well as in bibliographic classification is to ask why. Why is it that we choose certain things? My sense is that that leads us to when we ask the question why, it means that creators and maintainers of education have certain responsibilities. They have a responsibility to act in a particular way. And we have then asked sort of a basic question, on what basis can we make those commitments or those decisions? And my sense is that one of the more, sort of, what's becoming accepted is to say we do that from within domains. The way that Bjørn and others have introduced the notion of the domain analytic approach to information studies. My sense is within bibliographic classification, that's what we've come to. And it's within a particular epistemological question. So I think what we're asking now is, what are some moral questions, moral dilemmas that could happen in bibliographic classification schemes? What are some ethical decisions that we could make? And I think to get into that tonight, can I have a few moments? Yes. Now is to rephrase the question a little bit by inserting the notion of ethics and asking on what ethical basis can we make such a choice? And I think that's what I should talk about. There's been a few people that have talked about that, and I think one of, Claire was there a couple of years ago and talked about her position, and since he's a colleague of mine, I thought I should mention it. She'll talk about it. She's basing it essentially in one particular view of ethics, rights ethics, even though she says that it's not a particular view of ethics. It is a particular ethics. But the point is still, of reducing cultural bias. Oh, there's cultural bias, let's see if we can reduce it. Make it more fair, make it more even. Do away, move from over here to over here, to sort of get away from that. And Bjørn has also talked a little bit about it, and I think his position is we just have to be very conscious about the decisions that we make that are ethical or responsible. So I want to mention two frameworks that we could think about using. I'm going to say, first one I'm going to show, I can't use that, but there's another one that will get to that one. But there are basically two frameworks. One is we can look at a code of ethics. That makes sense, especially for us. When it says that, there's conflict, values in conflict, and we have to think about these things. And it very nicely embodies the ethical responsibilities of the profession. I think that's very good. And they say very specifically that it's to guide ethical decision making. It's not to make decisions, it's not to come from a particular moral standpoint, but it's to say, if you want to make if you have an ethical dilemma, here's a framework. And it gives us a cutout pieces here that put in yellow pieces that I think is important for us. We want to have a usefully and organized, appropriate and usefully organized resources. What does that mean? We have no idea. We don't know. Nobody tells us. They need to be unbiased. So, they're not over here. They're over here, right? Unbiased. They're useful. I think this one is very important as well. We need to distinguish between our personal convictions and our professional duties. One of the first things I had on the slide is there's no moral values in bibliographic files, no religion, no moral, no values. That we can distinguish between, now I'm on 9th Avenue, and now I'm up here flirting together with, and looking down and figure out how things actually are. That you can do that, that you can separate, that oh, that's just my personal opinion. There's my professional view of the same moral issue. How do we do that? How does people do that? How do we do that? It doesn't help. I think what it actually says is very good. Do the right thing. But it doesn't give you any guidance in figuring out how to do the right thing. If you look more into literature, it assumes the librarians are good people. And it assumes the librarian will, of course, make the right decisions. But it doesn't help us in actually making any decisions. So let's put that aside. Let's forget about that. So it's much more important to look into, let's go deep and look at moral philosophy. Let's look at what actually happened in those discussions. And I think there's three things that are important in sort of the moral discourse or ethical debates that we have in societies. One is that there is some conflict. We just cannot make a decision. I mean, it seems like there's no basis of making those decisions. That we have no more, oh, it's fine, it's just floating around, that's fine, if it works for you, that's fine for me. So I think that's one thing, that we as a society haven't made any commitments to looking at, or as a profession even, looking at morals. That we often make sort of calls to impersonal, rational arguments, but that's the right thing to do. You should do this because it is the right thing to do in that type. So we call to that. So those two things are a little bit in conflict. They're very interesting. And also, I think very important is that we have decontextualized many moral philosophies and theories. That we use philosophies and theories from way back when, and we use ideas, and we don't think about the context within those ideas, the context within there, and we think that we can import them into our states. And I think another thing that I think is important is that we're up against a little bit of resistance when we look at just social science theory and the way that many people think about social science theory. And I think that's especially, I mean, we're very conservative in information studies. We think that factual judgments can be true or false. The world is as it is. I mean, you just eat us a lettuce burger, it's not a lettuce burger, it's a hamburger. So we actually think that way many times. We think that we can harvest data. I mean, we think that all PhD students should go out and collect data. We don't know what data actually means. What it means is go out and ask people what they think, and then report that back. Is that data? No? Is it like physics? No. It's science. And then we also think that moral judgments are neither true nor false. That, you know, there's no basis for this. So we've made a split between is and ought. We think that there are things that are the way to go, and there are things that ought. And we can't talk about them in the same context. So we've made a split between individual life, the way to live life, my personal opinions, and facts. And that's a product of modernity. It's a product of modernity, it's a product of the time that we live in. We're not in a postmodern society. We're still in a very curling tale of a modern society. We still believe the world is what it is. We still talk about that in many research methods courses, in business. And we also believe that I am myself what I choose to be. That we have this free will, that we can just choose to be whatever we want. And you can be up against that. But you cannot decide just to go into a hamburger stand and say you want a lettuce burger. You cannot do that. You can't choose to do whatever you want. So we sometimes see that in literature on moral philosophy and ethics, some introductory books. You know, he's a guy who says we suppose that the world is exhausted by what is the case, but the physical world contains only what is and not ought. So there's no fact-making ethical commitments true. So this assumption that we cannot talk about ethics and we can't talk about ethical commitments as true or false, it's right or wrong. So we've sort of come to a state where I think, in society, that we think about ethics this way. We would say things like, wow, that's terrific. If that works for you, that's great. No, I have no commitment at all. Well, that's just your opinion. Right? You engage it this way, no, that's just your opinion. You can do whatever you want to. No, you can't. If they do that, this is very tricky. If they do it that way, fine. That's, especially when you think about other cultures. They're very difficult times of cultural relativism. This is very interesting that we have this notion that the thing is that the fact is, the world is as it is. We're sort of attached to naive realism at the same time that we don't want to engage in any more discourse on moral engagement. So we can think about this sort of pure personal preferences, which I think is different. I like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla. Oh, that's not a moral dilemma, right? That's just personal preferences. I like this and I don't like that. I like the Jewish system, I like AC. That's just personal preferences and nothing to do with it. And also, then there can be no disagreements. We can't disagree. We can say, well, Peter means something and Linda means something else. But that's just a disagreement on the way that they look at the world. It's not a disagreement on facts. 10?
6.
So what are the problems? The problem is basically that they claim there are two different judgments, one that can be evaluated and one that can't. I'm going to speed up a little bit now. What are some basic problems? The basic problem is that they're attached to naive realism. That they still think that the world is as it is, but they have a positivistic approach on top of that that seems, well, you can just do whatever you want. Right? So those are some of the basic problems that we interact with when we think about moral discourse today. So I'll give you a couple examples of moral philosophies that I think are attractive. First one, of course, is social contract. So this is sort of assuming that there is a set of rules. I mean, it's very closely to what I talked about before with language. There are some things that we decide on, as a whole, but let's think about these as a set of rules, and that we can negotiate those rules in society and think about them. Right? So it assumes that those, and we accept them, the rational men accept them. So if we assume that, we can have mutual benefits, that there will be a better society, that these responsibilities are made explicit, that they are there. This is the way that we look at the world. This is the way that we, in this context, of this domain, accept the way that it really should. The way, the technique for doing this is assuming that we can stand behind the veil of ignorance. Right? Assume that you don't know what your position is in society and describe the society that you want. You have no, you don't know where you're going to end up. What kind of society would you then develop? And I think many rational people will develop a particular view of the world. It has one problem. It's a complete fiction. It's a fiction because it assumes that there is a view from nowhere. It assumes that you are not over here, but that you can be over here and be behind the wheel. And we can say, well, I don't know anything. Of course you do. We can't accept people. Don't look, go behind this wheel and forget about your skin color. Now describe the world. Go behind this wheel and forget about your own religion and describe the world. I mean, that's what the ALA wants us to do. We want to say you have some personal convictions, you have personal religion, but now go behind this wheel and assume that you don't, that it's a fiction. Just forget about it. Happiness is another one that I think is really attractive. Why is that problematic? It's problematic for one reason that I think is very important when we think about classification. We get to vote, right? So the jury system would actually, for religion, would work very nicely because we just get to vote. Huh? Who is it? Who know? All the Christians? You're very happy? Good. You're in the majority? Good. It works. Everybody's happy. There's some people who are unhappy. So, which happiness should guide me? Which is it? Is it that I make some people sad because I get to vote and see? But what happiness is it that we get to decide? So, I think it has a common challenge, and now I'm actually at the very basic of what I wanted to talk about. That we need a teleological framework to think about ethics, and that it needs a context. And now we're getting back to what I talked about half an hour ago. And the way that we can frame this is to talk about a practice. So a practice is the avenue in which we set these decisions on what, how do we set a moral discourse. And examples of that, to think about it, I mean, first of all, we have to think about these practices socially embodied cooperative. So there's people coming together and doing things together. So here are some examples. Tic-tac-toe? No. Drawing football? No. Game of football? Yes. Chess? Yes. Brick lane? No. This is McIntyre. I actually disagree with brick lane. I think that's yes. There's some examples. Planting tulips? No. That's not a practice. Farming? Yes, that is a practice. There's people coming together deciding on it. There's a cooperating. There's people who are actively in relationships with each other to do things. So it's not an institution. It's not an institution. It's practice. It's people who are doing things. Institutions are maybe part of it, but it's not the institution itself. What's important here is that it's a relationship between people. It's the relationship between people who are participating. Have we seen that before? Yes, we have. We've seen that exact same view of the world when we looked at domain analysis in information studies. The definition that Hanne Albrechtsen and Georg Jørgen came up with a very long time ago in their first paper on domain analysis lines up very nicely with this way of looking at the world. Chopping out into particular context We're looking at what's going on in those practices, in those domains, in those contexts. And then we can ask what's happening. So the argument is that within a domain, or within a practice, there's some internal goods. There's some internal correct way of looking at the world. And there's some standards of excellence, and there's some standards of rules, and some standards of looking at the world, and we have to adhere to them. It's no different than accepting that we cannot say that it's perfect. It's the same thing. There's some standard within a particular practice that lays out the way that we make judgments or make value calls. So it goes away, it makes away with all subjective or very subjective analysis of judgments. So, and with that comes some basic foundational virtues, maybe of justice, courage, and honesty. And I think the one of justice. I'm just going to go a little over this. Here's the definition of how we can think about virtue. That's important. So if we want to say that something is good, we think about how would a rational human being in that practice accept this as being good? So it's not some objective things, but it's within the practice, and it's asking questions in that. So that makes an ethical decision a factual statement. Either it's a good classification or it's not a good classification. Either it's the right thing to do or it's not the right thing to do. So whether a classification is good or bad, good or not good, or good or just, is a factual statement. It's not a personal preference. It's not that I don't like this classification. So here's a sort of first take on defining that and saying what a classification is. So what are just classifications? What are some examples? So some examples that we often bring up is this one. Is this a just classification? You know, can we ask the question, is it a just classification? We think about the first definition, yeah, it's just a classification. Who cares? But if you take it serious and think about the harm that it does, and then ask, is it a just classification? So the way to think about it is to say, would a rational human being, within the practice of religion studies, choose this as a good representation of how religions should be organized? The answer is no. If we think about race, or think about Dewey's 96 classification of race, this is lifted from Jonathan Ferner's discussion of this. Is it just a classification? It's just a classification, right? But is it a just classification? Would people who study race, who engage in these discussions, would they think about race this way? No, they would not. So it's not a just classification. What they did in 2003, as reported by Jonathan Ferner, we can ask the same question. Is it just a classification? Race and ethnicity are sort of the same thing. You just lump them together. Would people who engage in this type of discussion, in this practice of race study, would they classify it? Would they use these words? Would they think about it this way? No. Is it a just classification? No. So, remember, justice is the first virtue of social institutions. Justice must be the first virtue of bibliographic classifications. How do we go about dealing with that? We're looking at the practices. We're looking at the practices, not the institution. We're looking at the practices in which they take place. So to sum up, see if someone took an hour to say these things, I could just show you this slide. Look at the practice or the domain. It's the same thing. Right? We're there. We just need to ask different questions within the same type of tradition that we have come to in classification theory. Not look at institutions, look at the practice. We need to make sure that the decisions that are made are in accord with the internal goods of that practice or that domain. And then we need to be conscious about these decisions. We need to be conscious that we make it epistemological. I think we push that agenda far enough. And I think I say you make ethical decisions when you classify. Be conscious about that and tell us, how did you come to this decision? I think that's the next question. Thank you very much.
5 minutes over, that's all. Very good. So we have 15 minutes for questions and responses to Dr. Mann's presentation. He'll take your questions.
Okay, good. We can go ahead.
One thing I find interesting about the idea about putting between how you connect it to the practice and the difference between epistemology. When you come over to talk to me about my poster, I'll use this as an example just because it's the clearest to me. When people, for example, identify as vegans, and that has a very particular food practice, what they actually think about in terms of food could be more in line with, the organic movement or this movement. So the epistemology, the way they think about the world and so forth, doesn't necessarily always link up to their practice. So how do you have any thoughts for how one might negotiate this?
So I think Joe's paper on how do we cut out what do we mean when we say domain or practice. I think that's important, and I think Joe can explain it much better, more detail. But it's a decision that you make, right? It's not that the practices are outdated and they're objective and they have sharp boundaries. They are like categories, right? And we make them up and we say, well, we're going to look at here, right? And no, not this thing out here, but this thing here, right? So you make a choice, but you also make a choice from a particular point of view, right? You make a choice because you already have some opinions about veganism, right? About food, right? Some people people who have different positions who live up on 12, they would ask different questions. They would look at veganism completely different than you will. So it's not the veganism, but the questions that you can ask, are they already in existence? And you're just uncovering veganism. You're telling a story about it. But you're trying to understand what's going on. What are some decision making that people make in those communities? And use that community practice. And I don't think that's far off from what I call veganism.
Yes. Well, I think the thought communities, which comes directly from me. And that's the way I think it is.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's just how to get at those different stories.
Yeah.
I guess there's a bunch of different methodologies to do that, but how to effectively not uncover it, as you mentioned, in terms of coming at data,
but also, I think thought community is a good way to think of it, but there's also, the activities that inform the thought are super important. What goes on in the kitchen is really, really important. What goes on in the other aspects of people's life are important for making a choice. Is it purely dogmatic? Is it purely philosophical? Is it purely because we don't believe in living? Why do we make those decisions? So it's not veganism doesn't exist as vegan. There's multiple aspects of it. And I think, that's why I think sort of the first part is really important as well. How do we come to the categories in the first place? It's not that they exist, but how do we come to the communities or the domains in the first place? It's not that they actually exist, we make them up. We cut up the world in a particular view of the world, and we say there's such a thing as veganism. We've accepted that, right? Yeah. So we've already, as a community, as a whole society, made a decision.
I'm curious to hear more about your teleological frameworks.
Yeah.
And what does that consist of? And what sort of, teleology to me implies a goal.
Yeah. I think the practice itself has a goal, and practice itself has a purpose. It's not that, I think veganism is a good example. They have a particular goal. They want to live healthy. They want to live a different life. They want to spare the world. And I think, and that drives and helps us define what a practice is in the community. And that's the same way that Viriolin talks about domains. Is we have to think about why is it that they come together? Well, they come together to study physics. Why? Because he believes very much in the research front. There's something that sort of pulls it forward. So there is some purposes there. So the purpose is to bring the practice together. It's not that you're just planting tulips. Okay? And the reason that it's not just planting tulips, even though that has purpose in itself, garden should have purpose, is that there's no goal. You just do it by
So, within the practice communities, are we looking at something that's homogeneous?
No.
No. So, can we come for that?
It's not a box, right?
Right.
It's not like either you're in the box or you're out of the box, right? So it's one of those types of categories, right, that you're made up. So it's not homogeneous within the
Right.
practice. So individuals, they come to the practice from So they have their own personal file. But I think what's important is to not focus too much on the personal, but focus on the whole community.
I guess my question is, do you have a conception of human flourishing you think is necessary in order to sort out better practices or actions from worse practices or actions? I guess I saw McIntyre's virtue ethics, Aristotle.
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to have a clearly defined conception of human flourishing?
That's a good question. You see, I have to abandon it. Could you push a little bit on that? Sure. What was it?
So I guess thinking about, you made mention to what a good man would do. Presumably a good man would choose certain practices over others.
Yeah.
They might have some criteria.
Yeah.
I know at least Aristotle has a pretty clear conception of what a human being is,
Yeah.
what it would mean to be an excellent human being.
Yeah.
And that would somehow inform
Yeah.
this practice or another.
Yeah,
Conception.
I mean, that's, I have to say, I don't know. I mean, I have to be honest with you that I'm attracted to this because it cuts it's a balance between not being dogmatic and focusing on local concepts and cultures and small groups. Together, finding a way. And the notion that we do it together. I think there's an alignment between how we do the language, how we do the mission, how we do thinking, how we cut the world. So it's in alignment with that. And we can make decisions about the right way of finishing works, even within the user. We can choose to do whatever we want to. Within the community, there are aspects that are decided by the community. And I think that thinking about ethics in the same framework, I think, is very powerful, very important. Because it doesn't become something that we push down.
One follow-up. Do you think there could be such a thing as intersubjective agreement on some of these categories and conceptions?
I agree with disagree. So, I don't know. It depends on, I think it depends on how we define institutions, how we define objectivity and how we understand in which framework we think about these objectivities. But I think at the end, no. Right? At the end, it's a decision of the practice, the activity, the thought communities that makes the decision on how we think about it. Whether the judgments are fact of, it's not personal. But at least personal opinion should be what will be driving the practice. You have to accept that you can be in disagreement with your practice community on a particular decision. But you have to accept it as a whole. I mean, I can have my view of what I think is happening, but I have to accept when I speak to you about how we have decided how we use that.
Taking sort of the community-based or domain analytic approach, I think you acknowledge that the classificatory structure is part of the problem. Would you say that with the domain approach that we can keep that classificatory structure as long as it's coming from the domain, or is that something that we need to work on trashing and redoing?
I think when I first started thinking about this, I had sort of Melanie Feinberg's argument in the back of my mind. And where I hear her end up is essentially saying, if they would just be explicit about what they do, and if they would just explain how they have come to, not saying, well, financial, but epistemological or ontological, then that's fine. And from an and I wanted to be in a position of saying, no, that's still wrong. So I don't think it's enough to just justify yourself as a social institution, because we're not into it. I mean, then you're just one player in a community, in a practice. It's no more different than me saying, this is the way I think race should be classified. I mean, who am I? I think making those decisions are decisions that we make in a collective whole, or that are made in collective wholes. And so there's something fundamentally wrong with the structures themselves. And to be able to get beyond an argument where people would say, well, that's just your opinion. No, it's not just mine. This is the way that, in this practice, that we think about these things. And I think that's the distinction that I think is important.
So I'm doing a paper tomorrow on interdisciplinarity, and that's where I'm really struggling with this, because what do you do when you have different communities of practice that have very different ideas of what a concept is or what something is, and there are values inherent. So I do sexuality stuff, and so much of it's medicalized, and so many of the things, and so then you have the humanities and social sciences and regular people who are left out. So there's a choice being made there. But how do you?
Okay. So
how do you
if I
reconcile that?
can do my analogy here again, right?
Yeah.
So there's some people who live here on
Right.
9th Avenue, and there's some other people who live here on 12th Avenue, and they look at the world differently, and now they have to talk to each other.
Right.
So the question is, if we want these people to talk to each other, do we then say, okay, that's fine, you can move over here to the point of being neutral and objective? Because this is a fiction, right? We go here, we drop down, we fall, right? There's nothing there. So what do we do then? Right? If I have these people here and I need these people there, what's happening in disciplinary studies is that we step over here, and some people come over here. And now we have created a different space. That's interdisciplinarity, that we have come together as opposed to trans. If it's inter, then there's something that we share. There's some concept, some idea that we share, that we start from looking at, right? So yes, when I'm a medical researcher who studies sexuality, I look at the world from a particular point of view, and I have to accept that. So if I want to talk to these people over here, well, I have to say, well, this is what I bring, but the way that we look at the world. So you create a different community of practice of domain that's here. And we all belong to multiple of these, right? It's not that you're just one person, you're just having one conversation. So if we were to develop a classification scheme into this sort of, these practices, it's a practice in itself. It's not these two put together. It's not plus, it's a new one. But that doesn't mean that as individuals they can jump between multiple practices.
What about when they're in conflict? So interdisciplinarity, I think, suggests that there's some potential for agreement. When they're in conflict, like I would say the humanities and the medical fields.
You work it out. We talk. What are the goods? How do we make the difficult decision? It's not that, well, these people are more right than these people, or this is the way that we should do things, or this is correct. Unless we assume, and ontology that assumes that there's a point of nowhere, if we assume that it's not, then we need to figure out, how can we make an agreement? And this is probably where the subjectivity discourse comes in. Can we make up that agreement? Can we figure out how do we look at it? What are some decisions? I mean, it's about a relationship between people, cooperating, working together for a particular purpose, a particular goal, so vast. So we've come together to study sexuality from an interdisciplinary point of view. That's the goal. That's what we want to do. It's not describe things as completely wrong. I say sexuality is something that exists, and now it's just described. So we're assuming that there is a position.
Thank you very much.